work for that, but in this moment we are all in the same battle. We are fighting the same powerful and invisible enemy. All countries in the world are hit, and we are all in front line.
Hello guys, this is episode 7 of season 6 of Italian Politician of the Week. I am Ipernik, the great is silent, and today we're talking about Aldo Moro. Moro is a staple of Italy's post-war history. His influence in the country and his tragic passing made him the icon of the years of lead, and today is remembered as some kind of martyr. However, what many people do when talking about Moro is to just talk about the way he died. Personally, I think somebody should give him credit for pushing for an alliance that could have ended the Cold War in Europe. Don't get me wrong, his murder is an engaging story of intrigue, mystery and conspiracy, but today I intend to focus on his political career and maybe shed some more light on his policies. If you want to know more about the darkest parts of Italian history in the 70s, check out the specific video I made on Moro's kidnapping and Licio Gelli's video that came out 2 weeks ago. Now let's begin. Moro was a law professor from Apulia. Born in 1916, he became professor of law philosophy in his mid-20s, first at the University of Bari and then in Rome starting from 1962. Moro was also one of the founders of Democrazia Cristiana, one of the youngest founders in fact, alongside Giulio Andreotti, which I mention way too much these days. Man, his video is going to be hard to write. Despite their similar origins, Moro and Andreotti had very conflicting opinions. Andreotti was a follower of the Gasperi and had right-wing ideas, while Moro was more open about collaborations with the socialists, hence adopting the political philosophy of Giuseppe Dossetti. In 1946, Moro was elected into the constituency, and in 1952 he joined the Dossettian Current, the left-wing group in DC that opposed the Gasperi's right-wing current. The members included people like the future Prime Minister Segni, Zoli and Fanfani. Moro stood out in the party at the time for his empathy and his ability to find compromises for good sake. I guess that's where political philosophy came to play. He adopted a policy of ethics and advocated for a country that cared for its people, honestly and fairly. It is with this attitude that he rose the ranks of the party and earned the respect of his peers and voter base. After the awful experience during Tambroni's government, here's a video on that right here, the right-wing current of the DC went through an identity crisis, which will last a very long time. This paved the way to the many center-left Christian Democrats such as Moro. In July 1960, Amintore Fanfani will form a cabinet entirely made out of DC ministers, with the external support of the Social Democrats, the Liberals and the Republicans. The goal of the cabinet was to introduce social reforms and to test the waters for a possible alliance between the Socialists and the Christian Democrats. In 1961, the PSI voted in favor of a possible alliance with the DC, and in 1962, the DC reciprocated at its own party congress. Initially, the only relevant opponent to Moro's openness towards the socialists was Antonio Segni, who held many left-wing positions in the past, like his land reform that abolished latifundia, but he also feared that letting the socialists in might eventually also allow the communists in the cabinet again, who perhaps might start a revolution and ruin everything the party had worked for in the past 20 years. Moro reassured his party that he had everything under control and that he only intended to raise taxes a bit to improve public welfare. Ultimately, what convinced Segni to go along with this was Moro's promise to elect him president of the Republic, which was effective. Shortly after the election of Segni, Fanfani made a new cabinet. The parties that had voted in favor of the last government got a few ministries. As for the socialists, well, they gave it their external support, first time in 15 years. June 1963, Italians Pokemon went to the polls and the DC and PCI took home a good amount of votes. Giovanni Leone is elected prime minister for a bit in what the DC called a transitional government. In the meantime, Moro and Nenni mediate and carefully choose the ministers and undersecretaries for this very important cabinet, which will make history. In December 1963, Aldo Moro will become prime minister with a cabinet composed of Christian Democrats, Socialists, Republicans, and Social Democrats. This alliance under Moro will last until 1968 and will be named the Organic Left Coalition. There were technically three different cabinets, but they were virtually the same. The shared electoral plan for the four parties was very ambitious. It contained, among other things, the regional reform, a school reform, a land reform, a housing reform, taxation reform, a pension reform, and a set of antitrust laws, all of which were passed with relative success despite the heavy opposition, specifically by the President of the Republic Antonio Segni. His views on Nenni and Saragat went from uneasiness to clinical paranoia due to his deteriorating health. Whenever Nenni and Moro had the slightest disagreements, Segni would panic, fearing that Nenni would call Togliatti or Longo from the Italian Communist Party and start a revolution. Fearing this would happen, Segni became close to General De Lorenzo, former head of the Italian Secret Services and at the time head of Carabinieri. According to some resources, De Lorenzo tried to take advantage of Segni's anxiety to gain more power and permission to spy on the political classes, for which he wrote multiple dossiers. Unfortunately for him, after a particularly tense argument with Saragat and Nenni, Segni had a stroke and resigned in 1964. De Lorenzo's dossiers will later be found in 1967 by Saragat, now President of the Republic. De Lorenzo will later lose all his military titles. By the next elections of 1968, Moro had gained a bit more votes and conquered the hearts of many left-wing moderates who just wanted better services. Unfortunately, many of the socialist voters felt betrayed by Nenni, not only for associating to Moro, but for getting closer to Saragat. The socialist minorities who were not happy with the social reforms and wanted more drastic changes voted for the communists, making the Socialist Party a much less valuable ally, hence making the Organic Left Alliance a lot weaker too. Due to the tricky nature of the negotiations, Leone was called in again to make a new transitional cabinet. At the end, Moro wasn't granted a new cabinet. Instead, it was given to Mariano Rumor, Segni's protege, and later Emilio Colombo from 1968 to 1970 and 1970 to 1972 respectively. Despite his relevant reforms on workers' rights and the introduction of public kindergartens, Rumor's legacy is overlooked. In fact, people tend to remember terrorist attacks more. Rumor also signed the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and introduced the concept of referendums to the Constitution. He will resign only because he couldn't make his ministers agree on how to make laws regarding divorce, something that Colombo will deal with. During these years, Moro will be Minister of Foreign Affairs. 1971 is considered the time when Moro's Organic Left started a substantial downfall. Andreotti re-emerged from the back row of the DC and pushed for the nomination of Giovanni Leone for President of the Republic, hence putting an end to Saragat's term and Moro's institutional advantage. All Moro had left was the public support. Andreotti counted on an even weaker Socialist Party that he could ditch to make his own centrist cabinet with the Liberals. But the 1972 elections were extremely underwhelming because simply nothing had changed. The balance between left and right was almost perfect, to the point that the cabinets were very unstable and short-lived. Andreotti will stay in power just for 2 years before Rumor and the Organic Left came back. Then in 1974, even Moro had a go, but his term lasted just as much as as his predecessors. Leone was getting sick and tired of the cabinet crisis, and with the oil shortage in full swing, he wanted a stable prime minister that wouldn't scare investors away, so he called for another anticipated election. Then it happened. The communists had reached their highest results ever, 34% of the votes to be exact, while the DC 38%. Not very reassuring margins. The right started freaking out, but then Moro went to Berlinguer and was like, "Hey bro, congrats, want to partner up?" And then the world started going nuts. Kissinger over the Atlantic was beating his wife more than usual. De Gasperi was rolling in his grave alongside Segni, and the socialists who had sucked for the third election in a row wanted to jump off a bridge. Check out Gramsci's video if you want to know how they got over that. Enrico Berlinguer, leader of the Communist Party at the time, was the inventor of Euro-communism and was very open to the European Union, as well as working with the DC. I talked about him already last season. From 1976 to 1979, Andreotti was prime minister with a fully Christian democratic cabinet, with the external support of the Communist Party. After almost 40 years, the communists were not in the opposition anymore. In exchange for their support, Andreotti alongside his ministers promised to pass some social reform. Despite the slow process, the alliance was strong and Berlinguer and Moro got along very well. Things were looking up. It was a matter of months before the communists could actually get some ministries. However, there were many groups that didn't want this compromise to take place. And so, on the 16th of March 1978, Moro was kidnapped by the communist terrorist group the Red Brigades. Again, I made a whole video about this, but in short, he was kept in an hidden apartment in Rome for 55 days, trialed for his crimes against the people, and then killed on the trunk of a car. Most parties during the crisis refused to negotiate with the terrorists before the murder, hence in many ways dooming him. So Moro spilled the beans and told the terrorists everything about the party, their schemes, and the nasty plots of politics. Then he wrote a lot of letters to his colleagues, mostly dissing them, particularly Andreotti, basically calling him a sociopath for, I quote, lacking generosity, wisdom, flexibility, and human fervor. Today, Moro is remembered as the philosopher-politician because of his way to mix religion and administration in an actually practical way. His fight for the truth had the ultimate goal of forgiveness and to rule alongside the wicked to form a generous state, a state that was present, that could help the less fortunate. However, the evil was overwhelming. He was too good for the First Republic, and sadly, we will never know how far his forgiveness went and how much he had to sacrifice for what ultimately turned out a lost cause.